What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 218. I'm the co-host Kyle Anzalone, joined by co-host Connor Freeman today. Connor, how you doing?
I'm great, Kyle. How are you doing today?
Good. Happy to have you back on the show. We got some Iran news, China news, and Yemen, where there's a big attack on the UAE that we'll be breaking down today's show. So everybody share the show. Find it at the Libertarian Institute. Connor will have a new article coming out there soon, so keep your eye on the featured article section. And of course, check out the daily news roundup that I put out. You can find the video version of the show on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey. Make sure you're following either the Twitter or the Facebook page. We're at con_interest on Twitter. Connor is at Freeman's Mind 96. I'm Kyle Anzalone _ and follow us. Make sure you're keeping up with our work and everything. Support the show. You could donate on Patreon, Subscribestar, and crypto. All that information is in the show notes page, as well as the information for the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. Connor, they have a great lineups at Paloma Verde. Tell me about your favorite.
I right now I'm using the soft gels. I take sometimes I'll do 50, but I take about 25 milligrams after some meal during the day every day. Just I don't know if anyone's ever taken CBD. It's one of those things where it's like you're gonna feel better. You'll be relax your body, make you take away any inflammation, any pain you got going on, make you more mobile, better for exercise and all this stuff. So it's like you might as well just take it, and it can really help you if you've got, like I said last week when I was very sick. Like a weekend or two ago, I took some of that and it just took away all the inflammation that was coming from whatever I had. It might have been COVID. I'm not sure. But I recommend highly the soft gels, and I've been a big fan of the tinctures for a while too. Paloma Verde makes, like I said, I've been using CBD for years out here in Arizona with the legal weed situation, and even with the stuff you get at the dispensaries, I've never had anything that competes with Paloma Verde. And also, I recommend those gummy bears as well, which are delicious and very effective instantly.
All right. Well, thank you, Connor, and everybody. Check out the great lineup of products at Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE, and that does get the show a kickback as well as get you a 25% discount when you spend $75 or more. So help yourself out, help the show. Connor, let's get into it. And you got some news on Iran to start off today. So what's going on with thoughts and everything else surrounding the Iran issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to start with I got some good news as far as Iran's relationship with Saudi Arabia and some of their regional diplomacy. So the Iranians have reopened their Organization of Islamic Cooperation office in Jeddah, which is a coastal city in Saudi Arabia. It's a 57 member organization. Um, and their office in Jeddah has been closed for 6 years following breakdown in relations, diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. But now we talked about this, I think, around in our episode we did around Christmas time about how they were getting visas from Saudi Arabia. But now Saeed Khatibzadeh, the foreign ministry spokesman, has announced that they have arrived. They got their visas and they're currently engaging in efforts to reopen the office. But what's even better, as far as everything in terms of the improved relations between Riyadh and Tehran, is he also said that, quote, the Islamic Republic of Iran is also ready to reopen its embassy in Saudi Arabia. But he added that this would hinge on, quote, practical efforts by the kingdom. But beyond that, since April, last year, Baghdad has been brokering a series of talks. There were 4 rounds between Tehran and Riyadh, and they say that now preparations are currently underway for the 5th round. And I believe this is Hossein Amir Abdollahian speaking to Al Jazeera, the Iranian foreign minister. He says, quote, I believe the Saudi side is interested in talks on some regional issues as well, but our negotiations for now are focused on bilateral issues and on when to return relations to a normal state. He also said that the two will need to engage in, quote, close dialogue to resolve regional issues in the long term. But I think again, with as far as them continuing to rebuild relations with states like even the UAE, and as we're seeing more and more of the Gulf states and regional rivals. Beyond that, like the Turks speaking with the Emiratis and the Saudi and UAE lifting the blockade on Qatar and rebuilding relations there. We're seeing a lot of positive developments, and probably the most important one, of course, is Riyadh and Tehran. All right. So now we're talking more about the JCPOA stuff and the prospects for a U.S. return to the deal. As basically anything you read right now, you're going to see that they're saying that basically a decision will be made here very soon, like in the coming weeks. A lot of things you read, they'll say that early February is when we're going to start to hear some concrete decisions being made. It's either phrased in an optimistic way, as I'll show from, was it Joseph Borrell, the European foreign policy, the EU foreign policy chief. He'll say things like, "Oh, it's we're getting very close. I think we're going to reach a deal in the next few weeks. I'm very optimistic." And he says things like, "I was pessimistic back before Christmas." And that's, basically my analysis here on the show as we've been covering it is around that time it started to appear after that 7th round of talks that the Iranians really did have the upper hand and that negotiations were continuing on the basis of their proposals. And that, that are basically the idea is that they want a full implementation of the JCPOA and full sanctions relief. But now we're hearing now that the Americans this is where I get a little bit pessimistic. Unfortunately, is because the Americans are basically saying there's this report in Axios that Dave DeCamp reports on here at antiwar.com about basically the Americans are saying that a decision is indeed coming in coming weeks, or they'll be making the decision here soon, and that they're going to one way or the other blame Trump for whatever the decision ultimately ends up being. And the reason that's bad, of course, is because So basically they're saying is like either they'll return to a deal and the U.S. will re-enter the JCPOA, or the talks will fail and they'll ramp up Trump's maximum pressure campaign, which for all intents and purposes has been continued. And in some cases, obviously the Biden administration has imposed further sanctions on Iran. So and I don't really see them returning to the deal and going – I mean, I'd like to think that that's what they do and say like, well, Trump put us in this situation and Iran had advanced their nuclear program. And what were we going to do? Just leave, the status quo as is. But now we have to return to the deal. I suppose you could make that argument if you wanted to, but it's more likely, I mean, Blinken recently gave an interview where he reiterated some of this rhetoric. As Dave points out here, Ned Price, shortly after this article came out from Axios, explaining the sort of PR strategy they were about to embark on, he basically debuted it at a press conference where he goes, it's worth spending just a moment on how we got here. It's deeply unfortunate that because of an ill-considered or perhaps unconsidered decision by the previous administration, this administration came into office without the stringent verification and monitoring protocols that were in place. Now, and Blinken has been making statements about how we're, running out of time to return to the deal. He has said things that are better than we've come to expect from Blinken in the last couple of months since talks restarted. Ordinarily, he's saying like, all options are on the table and this kind of thing. Now, he's still saying that, but he is also saying that if they do return to a deal, that would be the best thing for U.S. I think he said for U.S. national security. But he does, then again, he says things about how they're reaching enough visual material for a bomb and we're coordinating with our allies and we're going to have to basically look to other options and this sort of thing. So it's better on the scale of what Blinken's been saying, but it's not encouraging through the lens of, are we really going to reach a deal? Because the truth is, as we'll talk about here as we go further, the Iranians are seeking, guarantees on verifications of sanctions relief and guarantees that the U.S. won't leave the deal again. But we know that when they say they're going to blame Trump, the thing is, as it's becoming a little bit more unclear if Biden's going to be reelected. I doubt it. And so if it's a Republican, which it probably will be in that case, there's no way the JCPOA survives. So the Iranians are in a very bad a bad situation here anyway. And so I don't really see how the Biden administration could return to the deal and just use Trump as like the excuse because they can't even count on Democrats truly supporting the JCPOA. There's still a lot of hawkish Democrats who are against it. Now, House Republicans just sent a letter to Biden, more than 100 congressmen, saying that Biden should end the talks right now and strongly enforce the existing sanctions on Iran and immediately withdraw from these fruitless Vienna talks. Now, as Dave points out here at antiwar.com, that the Republicans are using all the horrible rhetoric of the Americans basically between the 29th when talks restarted and just before Christmas when Ned Price came out and for the first time said, we're making modest progress. Again, which is like, it was a big deal because they hadn't said anything positive up to that point. You heard positive things from the Russians and the Iranians and even Enrique Mora, the EU coordinator, but you didn't hear it, from the Americans. And even have heard some positive things from the French now since that happened or around the same time. So they're saying you should withdraw now, and they're saying basically that they're pointing to the administration's rhetoric before Christmas time, and they're saying, what's the quote? Administration officials' recent statements about the Vienna talks have made it clear that there is no diplomatic path forward at this time. And so again, this is highlighting the difficulties that Biden is going to have returning to the JCPOA one way or another. There's, the Republicans are virtually entirely against it. So there's a report that came out in Reuters that talks about how the Americans and the Iranians are at odds over guarantees for sanctions, the scope of sanctions relief and guarantees that the Americans will stay in the deal, as I just mentioned, and then the verification period that we've talked about before. And it's becoming more clear that the Iranians are saying they need at least a few well, not at least, but they want a few weeks to, I would say they should probably, push for more, but they're saying a few weeks to verify sanctions relief to make sure that they get, what's promised to them, which has been they haven't received even during the Obama administration. It was, they didn't get the full sanctions relief, and sanctions were even imposed the day the deal was signed. So, you can totally understand where they're coming from. The Americans are apparently telling them that they should only be a few days, which I wouldn't, that's that promise isn't worth much. Then also we have Western diplomats telling Reuters that early February is a realistic end date for the Vienna talks. And another Western diplomat says it's not really clear if Iran wants a deal anyway. But the Iranian official that's interviewed says that, quote, Americans should give assurances that no new sanctions under any label will be imposed on Iran in the future. We need guarantees that America will not abandon the deal again. Let's see. There's also some other quotes I'll get into here from the Iranians. It's not in this particular article, I believe, but they are saying things like there are no insurmountable issues, but that they sense that the Americans are stalling the talks because they have basically political liabilities, it sounds like. In fact, I'll just jump to that really quick. That's one of the more recent articles. They're saying that the U.S. is stalling the Vienna talks. The quote is Saeed Khatibzadeh says that if the U.S. lifts sanctions, they can reach a lasting, reliable agreement at a good pace. He also said that negotiations are going in the right direction, but we have no unresolvable negotiations are going in the right direction. We have no unresolvable impasses, but he is saying that there are crucial differences left in Vienna. Most importantly, the disproportionate speed of the opposing parties, especially the U.S., in the discussion of lifting sanctions. That talks are subject, to political decisions that have been stalled by the other side. All right. So I already talked about this, but Joseph Borrell, the EU official, the foreign policy chief, is saying we're arriving at the end of a long process. There's a better atmosphere since Christmas. Today, I believe we're reaching an accord is possible. This could come in where he said we might reach a deal in the coming weeks. He made these comments in France alongside the French foreign minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, who said that he had the opposite approach. He's saying that things are going much too slowly to be able to reach a result. And also Borrell said he still holds out hope that the JCPOA can be revived and, quote, function as it did before the American withdrawal. And let's see. So we also have Naftali Bennett speaking, with Putin and telling him that that the world powers involved in the Vienna talks need to take a strong stance and stand against Iran's progress in the nuclear project. What do we expect from Naftali Bennett? But what I do have here is that Mikhail Ulyanov, the Russian envoy in Vienna, says that last week on Thursday, they met with the JCPOA participants met with the American representatives and discussed, quote, the implementation of a future deal. He says, we need to agree on who will be doing what and when on the way towards the full restoration of the nuclear deal. That's not an easy task. He said that on Twitter. And then, let's see. So we have, I already covered the stuff that Blinken was saying, just basically making threats, saying that we're getting very close, that we're very, very short on time. The runway is very short. And like I said, he's making the nuclear bomb threat. They have enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon, or they're getting close to it. But he does, like I said, say it's the best result for America's security. And again, he's highlighting that this is one of the worst decisions ever made when Trump left the deal. And that's essentially it. We're at this kind of we're getting closer and closer to things going one way or the other. The Iranians want a legal pledge from the Americans because they know that it's impossible to get for a treaty to be ratified. It has to be they need 2/3 of the Senate, and that'll be impossible with the situation with the Republicans. And like I said, the Democrats are unreliable too. But the report in the Wall Street Journal about this cites unnamed diplomats who say that this guarantee demand appears to be, quote, a paramount political objective for Raisi.
So, Connor, if the Iranians, I'm sure, are able to access the U.S. Constitution and are able to understand U.S. politics, at least enough to know that it seems almost impossible that this thing would get ratified as a treaty, right? And so if they're not asking for the U.S. to ratify it as a treaty, I don't see any reason why the Biden administration just wouldn't agree to whatever legal guarantee they want. It's not like if the U.S. makes a legal guarantee and then, there's some kind of financial penalties, we'll have to live up to it and pay the Iranians those financial penalties. I mean, we just ignore international law whenever the hell we want. And so if they're not asking for the U.S. to do a treaty thing, then I don't understand why this is even a sticking point for the Americans. Just agree to it. And if it falls apart when the Republicans in office, then it's not your problem. I mean, that's essentially what Obama did with the deal. And so it just, especially with them now acknowledging how poor of a decision it was by Trump to withdraw from the deal, it makes absolutely no sense to me why they just wouldn't agree to the Iranian demands, because they're not that extreme and completely achievable. But that's not the administration that we currently have. Are we ready to start talking about China's role in the Middle East? This seems pretty important.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Chinese, speaking of Iran, the Chinese have come out and reaffirmed their opposition to the American sanctions. Let's see. So there was they've been hosting a few high-level meetings in China with the Secretary General of the Gulf Cooperation Council and the foreign ministers from, among others, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, and Kuwait. So now then after that, Hussein Amir Abdollahian, the foreign minister of Iran, traveled to China and met with Wang Yi, his Chinese counterpart, and they launched they announced the launching of that 25-year comprehensive, it's called this, I believe, a strategic accord is the name of it. But as far as Iran stuff goes, Wang Yi said he firmly opposes the illegal unilateral sanctions against Iran and the American political manipulation through topics including human rights and interference in the internal affairs of Iran and other regional countries. He made clear that the U.S. bears primary responsibility for the continuing difficulties vis-a-vis the situation with Iran. And Press TV, the Iranian news outlet reported that their foreign minister delivered a quote important written message from President Raisi to Xi Jinping. Although a lot of details haven't been revealed about that yet. It also says that the report also says here that Wang, in his meeting with the GCC countries' foreign ministers earlier, was talking about setting up a dialogue mechanism with Gulf countries to discuss regional security issues. Because at least according to the reports, and there's probably some truth in this, not necessarily that they're concerned about, like, Iran getting a nuclear bomb or something. I think that we're seeing that as they, start to warm up with Iran, that, I don't know. It's hard to say because I always wonder how basically how much of that is just Israeli and American propaganda and how aware, other countries are that truthfully Iran is not looking for a nuclear weapon. But there's still obviously the concern because of the long-term proxy wars between the two. But the reports indicate that those countries, the Gulf countries, look to, as they build more ties with China, they can kind of balance the two with each other as they rekindle relations or establish, new relations with Iran on a better foot.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the infrastructure deal with between Iran and China, that was just announced. They've implemented it, although they don't announce like any new projects or agreements that'll be a part of that. But that was a big part of Amir Abdollahian's visit with the Chinese. Of course, it covers all kinds of economic activity from oil and mining to even like agricultural and transport collaboration. It entails economic, military, and security cooperation. Of course, you have both countries under a lot of American sanctions, different levels of American sanctions. And they talk about how, for a few years now, they've been buying oil. The Chinese have been buying oil from the Iranians at a discount, although the price hasn't really been made public by either government. They also, they mentioned that Amir Abdollahian told reporters that Iran is ready to achieve an agreement here very soon in Vienna in the shortest time, and that this will be made possible with the support of the Chinese and the Russians. And then a readout said that Wang Yi supports Iran's logical position in the Vienna talks. And that also the other interesting thing here is about that letter to Xi Jinping. As I said, they don't elaborate on the details, but Raisi has made clear that his administration is emphasizing a Asia-centric foreign policy that considers China to be a big part, and China is a huge part of that. Mm-hmm. So, and now we can move in to China talking with the Gulf states about they want basically to build like a free trade zone, a free trade area. As I said, this is a big part of all these talks that were going on before the Iranian foreign minister arrived. They're talking basically they had a trade deal that was tabled in 2004 and talks have really stalled since then. But since in the interim, economic cooperation between the Chinese and a lot of states in the region from Saudi Arabia to the UAE to Oman has grown so much that and of course the region is a centerpiece of the Belt and Road Initiative. They want to make this more concrete. So they quote, so Wang Yi speaks with his Emirati counterpart and says Beijing wants to, quote, accelerate negotiations on the development of the free trade area to inject new impetus into enhancing ties with the GCC. There's a readout from the GCC Secretary General's meeting with Wang Yi. It says the two sides believe conditions are ripe for establishing a strategic partnership agreement with China and the bloc, and Beijing is looking to, quote, share the opportunities of its huge market with the Gulf. And they point out here that China is the GCC's top trade partner. In 2020, there was in bilateral trade between them that totaled $180 billion. So they talk about how the UAE and Saudi are currently globally in the top 3 countries for Chinese construction projects. China is also the biggest purchaser of Gulf crude oil, supplying China with more than 40% of their imports. They're big buyer. The Gulf states are buying a lot of Chinese surveillance technology. You've got Huawei 5G networks being built from Manama to Dubai. And Saudi Arabia is even helping. Excuse me, Beijing is even helping Saudi Arabia with nuclear technology and stuff like that. And in let's see, the meeting also says the readout also says that they've agreed to, quote, help the GCC countries become logistics and shipping hubs, leading neighboring areas, and bring more foreign capital and technology to the Gulf region. And they interview here in this report from Middle East Eye a guy named Jamal Abdullah, who's a scholar on the Gulf and a visiting professor of the University of Montreal in Canada. And he says, as we've discussed before here, that the flurry of diplomatic meetings this week, although we've talked more about the regional diplomacy with actors in the Middle East, but they make the same point about them building closer ties with China, that it demonstrates just how far the Gulf states have, he says they've moved towards China as they fret about the U.S. commitment to their security and grow discontented with Washington's criticism of their domestic politics and human rights. And as Trita Parsi has pointed out, a big part of why they're all kind of talking again and trying to quash a lot of these longtime rivalries is because they do sort of anticipate the U.S. Withdrawing further from the region and moving more and more towards China and Russia, of course, but particularly the Asia pivot. All right. I've got another article here from Middle East Eye about China. Wang Yi just visited Damascus, visited Syria, and they congratulated, they hailed Assad's re-election, and said they actually invited Syria to join the Belt and Road Initiative. They say Wang Yi said, quote, "We welcome Syria to become a new partner in the Belt and Road Initiative. We support Syria in its opposition to unilateral sanctions so as to alleviate the humanitarian hardship." So they've talked about in here about how Assad is looking to China to help him build his country back after, of course, the 10 years of devastation following America's dirty war there, and what seems to be an indefinite American occupation and sanctions maximum pressure campaign, where you have 80% of the people there living in poverty. And the UN has said, at least since February of last year, that 12.4 million people there are close to starvation, approximately 60% of the population. So they talk about, Assad is reported to have said to Wang that Syria wishes to join the Belt and Road Initiative and strengthen cooperation with China on economy, technology, culture, and education. And he says that they would like to adopt a policy that looks eastward. So similar to what the Iranians were saying. Now, they talk in here about how China has supported Assad and supported Damascus for a long time, condemning Western airstrikes. And out of the 16 times they've used their veto power on the Security Council of the UN, 10 of those were defending the Assad government. And let's see. They also talk about how this is where it gets a bit difficult, because it's unclear what this will all entail in the near term, because the estimates for how much money it will take to rebuild Syria after what the Americans, the Israelis, and the Saudis, the French and the British, et cetera, did with the war, it's going to cost $250 billion to $400 billion to rebuild. And to put that in context, as they note here, in 2018, Syria, the total budget for the government was $9 billion. So they say, even though countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia are warming to Damascus recently, it's unclear if they can overcome the American and EU sanctions. But Assad has emphasized that as they rebuild, it says that he's emphasized the favored status allies like China will receive if they partake in rebuilding bombed out areas. But where it gets, like I said, a little bit it's like I said, it's not, there's not as much room for optimism as far as rebuilding Syria. It looks like in 2018, Xi Jinping promised Syria would have access to millions of dollars in aid and reconstruction funds. And a year before, they said he would invest, or that Beijing would invest $2 billion in industrial parks throughout the country. But none of that is materialized at this point. And they interview a lady named Eliana Ibrahim, who's a Chinese national and the president of the China Arab Association for promoting cultural and commercial exchange, and it's located in Beirut. And she agrees, like she's very pleased. She supports this Beijing's move toward Damascus and vice versa, but she questions how deep the economic ties that can be built really are because of the sanctions. She says, so far, I don't see any Chinese national-owned companies investing in Syria. They also speak to a Lebanese businessman who I believe only gives his first name, but he essentially works as a consultant with Chinese companies who are looking to do business in Syria. And he says the country is safe, relatively, but they're more the Chinese are more concerned about sanctions. He says they don't want to have problems with the Americans. So they say that smaller firms have been moving in, but not really the big terms. So there seems to be some sort of a lucrative business. There seems to be like deals going on where certain companies or certain actors import Chinese like solar panels and like put them toward use in projects funded by like Syrian nationals. But a lot of these deals are like few and far between. Like you have, they say they interviewed a guy named Dayan, who's a Damascus-based businessman who imports LED lights from China and sells them wholesale and retail. But he says because of the war and currency devaluation, the people have no money. It's very difficult. So it doesn't appear that this will be something that can be enacted like I said, in the short term, but long term, hopefully they start to figure out ways to work around the sanctions. But as we've seen before, Blinken has come out and I think in October, Antony Blinken came out and said that they fundamentally oppose Syria's reconstruction and that basically they will maintain these crippling sanctions and what amounts to a maximum pressure campaign on Syria until Assad is no longer in power. I don't know who they want to replace him with. It seemed like early on in Biden's administration, they were promoting Jelani again, doing a lot of PR for the head of what's basically Al-Qaeda in Syria. I don't know how much that's moving ahead, but they want to get rid of Assad and put somebody in there who will be like a U.S. puppet, or as we saw before, they really don't care. They just want to get rid of Assad. And as Obama and Jeffrey Goldberg discussed, take Iran down a peg. So, like I said, all these issues here are very interrelated, but it's good to see that at least there's more and more countries in the region, and also obviously China, that want to help Syria. To the extent that they can is unclear, but that's a good thing anyway.
All right, Connor, let's talk about some, more actual China news here dealing with the U.S. relationship with China. We had the USS Nevada, which is a Ohio-class submarine that, nuclear powered, carries a bunch of nuclear weapons, and it made a port call in Guam. I just want to mention before you get into this, Connor, in the news roundup, I did have it incorrectly that it made the port call in Taiwan. It did make the port call in Guam, which is a significant difference, and I'm very sorry about that mistake in the news roundup. So just wanted to clarify for anybody who didn't catch the correction that I put in there after I realized the mistake that was the case. So, Connor, what's happening with this visit?
Yeah, so this is they haven't sent a nuclear sub like this. They're called boomers. This is, as you said, the Ohio-class nuclear-powered submarine, and it's carrying 20 Trident ballistic missiles and dozens of nuclear warheads. And so it's docked there in Guam right now, and this kind of deployment hasn't taken place since 2016. It's the second announced such visit since the 1980s. A U.S. Navy statement said the port visit strengthens cooperation between the U.S. and allies in the region, demonstrating U.S. capability, flexibility, readiness, and continuing commitment to Indo-Pacific regional security and stability. Of course, with the Olympics going on and everything, this is extremely provocative. And of course, the Chinese have a big interest in limiting military tensions, especially in their neighborhood right now. So this is deliberately meant, I believe, to kind of put a thumb in their eye. Um, there's some other news that's come out. We have Japanese warships sailing near Chinese-controlled islands in the South China Sea. Um, let's see. So that has occurred 2 times in the last 10 months. They're not getting as close as the Americans typically do with their phone ops, although they're calling them phone ops. They're calling them freedom of navigation operations. These were government sources cited in a Japanese newspaper. And they claim they're doing this to deter China. But they're sailing within the contingent zone of the Spratly Islands, which includes things like the Whitsun Reef, which there's disputed claims over it. The Philippines claim that, as well as the Chinese and the Vietnamese. It's like a lot of different reefs, islands, archipelagos, and islets in the South China Sea. You have all these competing claims going on, and the Americans come in there and sail warships, doing their so-called freedom of navigation operations, and more or less militarizing the region and rejecting all of China's claims. Now, like I said, this is the contingent zone that the Japanese are sailing in. So that's 24 nautical miles from the coastline. And as I said, ordinarily the Americans go through the territorial waters, which are 12 miles. They extend 12 miles out off the coast. Let's see. So, of course, this is as there's more and more tensions being built up around the Senkaku Islands, with more and more Chinese, Coast Guard ships and Chinese patrols going on in the area. Those are claimed, of course, they're controlled by Japan in the East China Sea, but they're also claimed by China and Taipei. As in the case of what I just mentioned, the Whitsun Reef, you have the Americans stating basically that we'll go to war over these reefs and these islands out there. And like in the case of the Senkakus, these are uninhibited. This is the case with quite a bit of what all this supposed all these things we're supposed to supposedly go to nuclear war over. That's the case with quite a bit of these different features in the South China Sea. Let's see. So. Oh, and Dave points out, of course, that the German, the French, and the British have been sailing warships through the South China Sea last year as well. So that's been escalating. But again, as we noted, I was surprised too when the British, I think it was when the British sent that ship in around summertime. They did not, again, they also do not do what the Americans do, getting as close as they do to Chinese-controlled islands. And they stay out of that, not the territorial waters. Excuse me. And now we've got some aircraft carrier strike groups that are going into the South China Sea. And I'll just point out, actually, that I just picked this up. We just noticed this today in the reports that are coming out about these joint drills around the Spratly Islands that went on. Biden, in his first year in office, obviously we've discussed before, vastly escalated the number of sorties of warplanes and spy planes in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Yellow Sea. There were over 2,000 sorties last year. What was it in the South China Sea, Kyle? Was it like 94 in the month of November or something like that?
Oh, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I'm sure it was something like that.
But now we sent 10 aircraft carrier strike groups into the South China Sea 10 times last year, up from Trump's record of 6 in 2020, and there were 5 in 2019. And again, just to point out with the sorties that are going on in the South China Sea, that again, it's the Biden administration has escalated this stuff. I believe it was less than 1,000 or very close to 1,000, but still under, in 2020. And at the time in 2020, it seemed like things were getting out of control. But of course, there's always this ratchet effect. So let's see. So this is just after the People's Liberation Army Navy the PLA Navy held simultaneous drills with 2 aircraft carriers in the South, one in the South China Sea. And of course, this is on the eve of the Winter Olympics and the Lunar New Year. So it's, again, like I said, very provocative. And so we have the USS Carl Vinson, which is the aircraft carrier strike group, and this is it includes besides frigates and supply ships and submarines, it has or excuse me, besides frigates and supply ships, they have 9. Let's see, it's the Ticonderoga class guided missile cruiser USS Lake Champlain, and the destroyer Squadron 1, which consists of 5 Arleigh Burke class guided missile destroyers. And so it sailed into the southern waters of the South China Sea and met up with the USS Essex Amphibious Ready Group, which is a helicopter landing group. And that includes, let's see, it's the amphibious transport dock USS Portland and an amphibious dock landing ship USS Pearl Harbor. And they say that the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit and Amphibious Squadron was also going to take part. So they held a 5-day joint drill around the Spratly Islands, and they began, let's see, it would have been the Saturday, it looks like they finished it up. Yeah, they completed it this past Saturday. And so this was kicking off the 2022 naval schedule 2 weeks earlier than last year. So this is this piece from the South China Morning Post that is at Business Insider. And so they interviewed the director of the South China Sea Strategic Probing Initiative, which is the Beijing-based think tank that keeps track of all these different sorties and warship transits and things that we've been covering here on the show, especially since 2020. And you can read a lot of this constantly being reported by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com as well. But the director of the organization says the U.S. military drastically reinforced their military deployment in the South China Sea last year in terms of reinforce their military deployment in terms of training skills, sorties, and scenarios. So he talks about, like I said, the escalation in aircraft carrier strike group deployments, but they're also talking about how they're diversifying their routes and operation time spans to try and basically throw off the Chinese and overcome their anti-access area denial military strategy to prevent foreign incursions into the South China Sea, military interventions into the South China Sea and in the waters off Taiwan. So they interview Lu Li Sha. I don't know how to pronounce that last name. Shi, who's a former instructor at Taiwan's Naval Academy. And he says that U.S. strike groups appear to be trying to, like I said, counter the anti-access area denial strategy. He says, I believe the U.S. Navy is trying to escape the over-the-horizon radar systems on 3 artificial islands of Mischief, Subi, and the Fiery Cross Reefs, which have targeted U.S. warships and aircraft before. He says the U.S. Navy can use these geographical features of the Philippines to approach the region and suddenly appear somewhere out of the PLA's expectations, because the radars have limitations when it comes to monitoring approaching objects coming from the archipelagos. And so that's essentially it. It looks like they're trying to this all has to do ostensibly anyway with contingencies, as in the case of like a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. As they interview, what's this guy's name? Colin Koh, who's a research fellow from a School of International Studies in Singapore. I can't really pronounce the name of it, but he says, quote, instead of using only those traditional routes, the increased use of lesser-known alternative routes reduces predictability with respect to the movement of the U.S. military. And like I said, it's for these contingencies, like a war with over Taiwan or something like that.
All right, Connor, a few more stories on China that I want to talk about before we move on to Yemen. We have some official numbers in on Biden's China trade policy, and it pretty much has resembled Trump, and we now have the proof of that. This is from Forbes, titled, It's Official, Trump Loses Tariff Man Crown to Biden, 2021 data shows. And they're looking at data from the first 11 months, of 2021. So that's through November. And during those months, the U.S. collected $77.4 billion in tariffs, and that is about $3 billion more than the U.S. collected in 2019 through the total year. And so it's probably going to exceed well over $80 billion this year. And it just goes to show that Biden has largely kept Trump's terror policy in place. Now on Taiwan, a couple stories. The Taiwanese legislature passed an extra $8.6 billion for their defense budget. It seems like this is going to go towards some big ticket items like new Corvette class ships and other things like this. So we're going to see increased spending from Taiwan on their military. Of course, the U.S. is giving, or has talked about giving, Taiwan $1 billion in aid a year for their military. Also, this very interesting story, Connor, and I don't think I've ever read anything like this before. Taiwan is going to pay $900,000 to the Ballard Partners, which is a lobbying group run by a former Trump administration official. His name is Brian Ballard. And this group is going to lobby on behalf of the Guatemalan government, but Taiwan is going to cover the cost. So, there's been times where, like, say, the Saudis or the UAE have used, but I believe paid for, like the Israeli lobby network to push certain legislation or things like that. But this is like, the Taiwanese government seeming to bribe the Guatemalan government to maintain relations with Taipei versus to switch relations back to Beijing, which we've seen recently in other Latin American countries like Nicaragua. And so it seems like a bribe is just a very curious way to pay a bribe, Connor. Have some weapon sales going on here. Thailand is going to get they're asking for and approved the budget to spend $414 million on 4 F-35s. It would be their first purchase of F-35s if it ends up going through. The Philippines is planning to buy 32 Black Hawk helicopters from Poland. The U.S. held a joint defense, what they're calling the trilateral call, with Japan and the Republic of Korea. It seems like, I guess, maybe to just the average American that you would assume, the U.S., South Korea, Japan are all on the same team against China. Really not the case, where Korea maintains longstanding grievances and like war-related reparation issues with Japan from the occupation of Korea and, the forced labor, the comfort women, all those issues. And so it's not exactly clear that, South Korea is just going to go along with what the U.S. and Japan won here. And South Korea has a far deeper trade relationship and just a proximity relationship with China than the other countries do. The senator, the Great Hawk, Marco Rubio, has introduced a new bill in the Senate to sanction Chinese officials who continue to obstruct independent investigations into the origins of the coronavirus. I kind of doubt that this bill will pass, but it's an anti-China bill, and maybe if the Democrats start to get on board, it could build some momentum and pass. Connor, my inclination now is that if we really want to get to the root of the origins of COVID, that may be found far better in emails of U.S. government officials than we're going to find on the ground in China at this point. Speaking of COVID in the China region, there's been major outbreaks of COVID in Japan, specifically stemming from the U.S. bases in Okinawa. The bases in Okinawa are massive and take up huge parts of that island. The people there hate that the Okinawans hate that the U.S. is still occupying the island. But to make it even worse, it was the origin for a massive COVID outbreak. And so on January 10th, which I believe was a Friday, the U.S. said, or it was like the Friday of that weekend, that, starting that Monday, that the troops would no longer leave the base for 2 weeks. But then the U.S. and Japan just this week had massive war games. The Yama-Shakura war games that involved 3,000 troops from Japan, 1,500 troops from the U.S. This was the 41st annual year for the games, although it's called the Yamashikura 81 games. So go figure how they do that math to get 81 there in 41 years of the games. But that's what they're saying. And they say it is the largest war games to date between the two countries for this iteration of the annual war games. And so it's not even that they're scaling down war games between the U.S. and Japan when American soldiers are obviously causing massive COVID outbreaks in Japan. They just keep going with it anyways. Two more quick stories on China, Connor. And one is that Kazakhstan with the recent unrest in Kazakhstan, China offered security support. Not sure how this is all going to play out. I think there's maybe a little bit competing interest between China and Russia and Kazakhstan. And so, maybe if it's leaning more towards Russia, they're not going to take the China security help. But if the U.S. gets involved, that might push that issue. And then last, this is more a story about North Korea and is going to have far more significance in North Korea. But I wanted to mention that North Korea has finally allowed rail to resume, rail freight between the two countries. And so interesting that this is happening. North Korea is the only country that I think has really pursued a no COVID policy, where they've essentially done or at least from reporting, have done a lot to prevent smuggling, trade, any type of travel, to prevent COVID from entering North Korea. Maybe they're moving away from that with this. Unclear what it means for the overall Korean policy on COVID, but very interesting that, that they're now going to resume some trade with China, especially as, from my understanding, China has a relatively large COVID outbreak at this point. They've shut down and are doing massive, like tens of millions of tests at a time to try to, slow the COVID outbreak there. Connor, we'll move on and talk about Yemen, where there is, I guess a few important stories, but maybe the most important, and certainly the one that's actually generating some headlines in the U.S. mainstream media, is the UAE's oil facility being hit by the Houthis. But I want to start off and just mention that before that, Saudi Arabia announced that they were going to intensify their airstrikes of Yemen. And again, this announcement came before the Houthi strike on the UAE oil facility. Now, my guess is that this strike may have targeted the UAE because of an issue I talked about the last time we covered Yemen on the show, Connor, and that was the UAE had backed the Yemeni Giants Brigade, and this is a group of Salafists in Yemen, about 15,000 people, a part of this militia, and it was able to turn back Houthi gains in the Shabwa and Murad province, gains that the Houthis had worked on for a long time. This is a militia in Saudi Arabia, or in Yemen, that's, while backed by the UAE, loyal to the Saudi-backed government of Hadi. And so, for whatever reason, after this, the Houthis carry out this drone strike. Now, it could have nothing to do, I guess, with the Giants Brigade taking that territory, but I don't know. I'm kind of suspicious. I think that might have something to do with it. And so they launched an attack. Ultimately, at least three drones hit their mark, hitting a key oil facility and setting three oil tanks on fire, or petrol tanks on fire. They say that 3 people were killed in the attack, 2 Indian and 1 Pakistani man. So none of these people were actually of the UAE. Good reminder that, in these Gulf countries, they have lots of imported and migrant labor, that this isn't, I think in Qatar they have far more migrant labor workers than they actually have citizens of the country. And so very unfortunate that this is who ends up paying the price for the prince's wars. But it's not really unexpected that the people of Yemen will eventually seek to retaliate against the Saudis and the Emiratis, who have been raining bombs down on their country for the past 7 years now. There were also reports that this caused some kind of damage and fires at a UAE airport. I believe the airport in Abu Dhabi, actually. However, not exactly clear to me how extensive that damage is. if this is going to make any impact in the world oil market, like, say, the 2019 attack on the Aramco facilities in Saudi Arabia did. But, it's significant. If you look at a map of Yemen, and almost all the population, everybody lives in the west of the country. The Houthis control Sana'a and the areas around Sana'a. So this is a relatively far way away from Houthi-controlled territory, Connor, that they're able to carry out this attack with some kind of accuracy. Of course, the U.S. mainstream media and the Saudis and the Emiratis and, the entire world empire is blaming the Iranian-backed Houthis for this attack like it, was definitely a result of Iran. I'm not so sure that that's the case. Now, maybe Iran was somehow involved in giving the Houthis some of this technology or something like that. I'm not saying that that's the case. Maybe it is, but it doesn't exactly mean that this attack came in the direction of the Iranians. In response, the Saudis bombed the capital of Yemen. 6 people were killed in a strike on a camp for the 1st Armored Division, that's the Houthis military. And then another 14 people were killed on an attack in a civilian neighborhood against a Houthi general. He was killed, his wife was killed, his 25-year-old son was killed, and at least 6 other people that lived in that house. And so, Connor, my great suspicion is that not all these people killed were at all involved in the fight, and a lot of them were just civilians. Also, this, was in a neighborhood, and so some of the people who were dead were, just happened to be people who lived next to this guy. The UAE is calling for the United States to label the Houthis as a terrorist group in response to this attack. I don't think the Biden administration will go along with this. Connor, if you remember back to the beginning of the Trump administration, or of the Biden administration, the very end of the Trump administration, they named the Houthis a terrorist organization. Then the Biden administration removed that label. So it seems unlikely that they would slap it back on. However, not impossible for that to happen. The Israelis are also signaling their support to the UAE after this, saying that they will offer military and intelligence support to the UAE. Not exactly clear what kind of support they're offering. Intelligence support, satellite pictures, things like that. Military report. Are they talking about maybe providing the UAE with an Iron Dome light system or something like that to try to combat these attacks? One thing we can't leave out when we're talking about this, Connor, is that in the coming weeks, Saudi Arabia is going to be asking for more Interceptor, Patriot missile systems from the United States. If the Senate or House rejects this and does not allow the sale to go through, it could be something that forces the Saudis to the negotiating table. I really think this is huge, but if there's, a lot of these kinds of attacks going on, it's going to be used, at least by the Hawks, as propaganda, see how bad they need these systems, and they're going to use that to push the sale through. So I fully expect that that's going to happen, but just wanted to point out that, it's kind of funny that every time they need interceptors, it seems like a couple of these missile attacks end up getting through somehow. I don't know. Yeah. I don't want to make out to be too much of a conspiracy, but it sometimes seems suspicious to me.
I picked up before we started the show on the antiwar.com newswire. Jason Ditz just wrote something about the strikes in Sana'a. The most recent ones are the worst since 2019. I think it was something like, at least right now they're saying around 20 people have been killed. Yeah. And again, like you're saying, it sounds like it's mostly civilians.
Yeah, and I guess them saying it's the worst since 2019, I just get a little suspicious that they probably killed more people in airstrikes since then, but at least what's reported in the Western media, that does seem to be the case. Right. Last story on Yemen I want to mention here, Connor, and that is the UN is calling for the release of a UAE ship that the Houthis seized at the beginning of January. Remember, at the beginning of January, there was a few attacks on U.S. Bases in Iraq that housed U.S. soldiers in response to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the 2-year anniversary. On that same day, the Houthis seized a UAE boat. The Houthis claim that this boat was loaded up with weapons. The Emiratis say it was just medicine. My guess is that there may be both, true. There's probably a gun and a first aid kit on that ship. Now, there's probably a lot more of one than the other. I have absolutely no clue, which way was biased, but I wouldn't be surprised, if there was even a significant amount of both, some medical supplies and weapons that, that if you have an army on the ground, you do need medicine for them. So just because you're bringing medicine somewhere doesn't necessarily mean it's for the starving and sick children and all that. The seizure of the ship was interesting because I think I saw a report. It happened off the coast of Sqahorda, which is an island in the Gulf of Aden and not necessarily near where the Houthi held territory is. So that would maybe suggest that they have some pretty sizable naval capabilities. I mean, not enough to break the Saudi blockade, but if you're seizing UAE ships, that's something. And also maybe coordination with people who are living on the island of Sqahorda, even if that is, I think, pretty much UAE territory at this point. I don't really think the Hadi government, the Saudi-backed government, which is the internationally recognized government of Yemen, I don't think they really control it. I think the UAE pretty much controls it at this point. So, anything else on Yemen, Connor?
Well, I was just gonna say with Sqahorda, aren't they built? The UAE's building. They have a lot of construction out there.
Yeah, military bases and places for the princelings to go. This is, I don't know how widely it's called this, but at least if you search Galapagos of the Indian Ocean, this island comes up. There are a few specific unique species. There's these really cool looking dragon blood trees that grow uniquely on that island. And so, there is probably a lot of that island's natural, biodiversity is going to be destroyed by this. And, people looking more for a nice vacation spot and a place to land planes and, these massive military planes and not really, caring about the people that live there and then the natural beauty of the island. Connor, that's probably a good place to wrap up the show for today. Thanks so much again for joining and being the co-host. Everybody, we are updating, the descriptions for the show and everything as Connor is an official co-host now. So if you notice that's not updated somewhere, feel free to let me know. But no concern if you see that you go to the subscribe star or something. Connor's not yet on the page. I am just kind of slowly getting around to updating everything everywhere. But yeah, Connor's officially on board. I'm very happy about that. So I don't know, just support the show, continue to do what you're doing. The show is an excellent 2022 so far, and we plan to continue that. So thanks for joining, Connor.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, everybody.